In this video, learn how to control the ISO setting on your Canon DSLR for better exposures at higher sensitivity settings. ISO is the sensitivity of your Canon DSLR's sensor to light, and the third ingredient in the exposure triangle along with shutter speed and aperture. We pick low ISO numbers when we're shooting in bright light, and we increase the setting the more the light levels drop. If you're shooting with your camera attached to a tripod and a slow shutter speed is not an issue, then keep the ISO as low as possible, e.g. ISO 100. Only increase the ISO when you need to adjust the other settings. A classic case is when we need our shutter speed fast enough for shooting handheld, so any movement of our camera and lens in our hands won't cause a blurred photo. So this is what we've done for our shot of a musician on stage in very low light. Shooting at ISO 100 and f6.3, our shutter speed was very slow at only 1/8 of a second, which meant a blurry handheld photo. By increasing the ISO to 1600, it's increased the sensor's sensitivity, which enables us to select a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second for a good sharp handheld shot. The downside is the higher the ISO, the more noise that is visible in your images. Also, on smaller APS-C sensor cameras, e.g. a Canon EOS 800D, noise is more apparent, compared to larger sensors on full-frame cameras, e.g. the Canon EOS 5D Mark IV. In simple terms, this is because the sensors and therefore the pixels and photo sites are larger. Generally speaking, on most Canon DSLRs, up to ISO 1600 is okay, whereas ISO 3200 and up is when images start to get a little noisy, but you can reduce the noise fairly well in software like Photoshop. There are a couple of ways to adjust the ISO on your Canon DSLR. You can either use the ISO button on the top panel of your DSLR, or use the Q button and navigate to the ISO settings on the LCD. A typical range will start at ISO 100 and go up to ISO 6400 or 25600 depending on your Canon DSLR. When shooting in daylight, then you'll want to keep the ISO setting as low as possible. On your Canon camera, the optimum ISO setting is 100, and this is when it will produce the highest image quality results possible. If you're taking images on overcast days, you may need to push the ISO up to 400 or 800 to compensate for the lower light. You can use higher ISO settings when you need to increase the shutter speed in low light. Note that the more you increase the ISO, the more the image quality or noise appears. It's a game of compromise between keeping the ISO as low as possible and avoiding camera shake caused by slower shutter speeds. Here's how we can use ISO to help us get a better exposure when we want to fix our aperture and shutter speed. We're shooting a scenic shot here near the end of the day, and we want a narrow aperture of f8 and a shutter speed of 1/80th a second for a sharp result. But with our ISO set to 100 in the ambient light, the exposure is very dark. But if we push the ISO up to 1600, which is a 3-stop difference, the near nighttime image is well exposed. And here's another nice example of how to use a higher ISO setting, which has enabled us to capture a colourful sunset shot. This is handheld with no tripod, and our exposure is 1/60th of a second, f7.1 aperture and ISO 800.